Hello and welcome to episode 157 of the Chills of Will podcast. What a pleasure today to be speaking with Ilana Masad and a biography of Ilana a bit. Ilana Masad is a queer Israeli-American writer of fiction, nonfiction, and criticism. Her work has appeared in the New Yorker, New York Times, LA Times, Washington Post, NPR, StoryQuartlerly, Tin House's Open Bar, 7 by 7, Catapult, Buzzfeed, and many more. A graduate of Sarah Lawrence College, she has received her master's in English from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where she is currently a doctoral student. She is the author of the novel All My Mother's Lovers, which, if you're watching at home, here it is. That will be the main thrust of our conversation. Welcome. Good morning, afternoon.
Good morning. Yes. Good morning
That's
to
right.
you
You're on the west.
too.
Yeah.
I
Good
am.
morning.
Yes. Or good afternoon to you, I guess. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you. How is the grind of being a doctoral student?
Well, I'm now in my last year, hopefully.
Hopefully.
And the grind was very real at the beginning when I was still
Huh.
doing coursework, because I was doing coursework and freelancing. But now it's mostly just teaching, and I'm working on my dissertation, which is the next novel, also, hopefully.
Okay. Nice. Did you feel like you had to force that, like as in I need a dissertation, or was it like it's been natural where it's a good fit?
I mean, no, it's a good fit. That's part of why I wanted to go to a creative writing PhD,
Mm-hmm.
because I knew that I would be able to do a creative dissertation. So I knew it would, be a novel.
All right.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'd love to go back a little bit
Mhm.
and I'd love to know about growing up in Israel. I mean, I'm not
Yeah.
sure when you moved, how old you were when you moved, just about like your language or languages growing
Mhm.
up and kind of like your relationship with the written word.
Yeah. So I was raised bilingual, but I didn't start speaking Hebrew until we moved to Israel, which was not for any ideological reasons, just because my dad grew up there. His parents were immigrants after World War II. Both were survivors, and so and he's an only child. He was an only child, and so we moved there because his father was sick with cancer, and there was sort of no one else to help
Oh,
out, and they didn't have the money to hire people. So we moved back, and that was really when I started speaking Hebrew, because apparently until then I would understand Hebrew, but I would answer my dad in English.
mm,
But then when we moved, I started going to nursery school in Israel, and so I suddenly had to speak Hebrew because that's what all the
mm.
other kids were speaking. So that was, when my real like bilingualness, I guess, started,
Ah,
in terms of speaking, not just understanding.
right.
Um, and it's so interesting because I now, having lived away so long, my Hebrew is very rusty, which makes me
Mm,
very, very sad because
yeah.
I love it as a language. And in terms of the written word, I was always a kid who loved being told stories. I loved being
Mm,
read to, but I had a terrible time learning to read.
mm,
I remember we had, like, those homework booklets that you have when you're like in first grade. And I remember hating doing my homework in first grade and like needing to fight with my parents about doing it.
mhm,
And my mom also then taught me to read in English. And so that was also horrible because I just was so resistant.
mm,
And I think it wasn't really until I was 9 that I started I mean, like, I could read before that, but I didn't start reading books on my own until I was 9. And sort of from then on, I never looked back. And I
right.
became a huge reader as soon as I really started getting into it.
Wow. That yeah. I mean, the fact that it took a little while, but man, you picked up steam is obviously
I sure
very
did.
encouraging for all of us, right? I mean, you made your
Yeah,
life
yeah.
about that. You made your life about the written word and books,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
Oh man. Well, thank you for that. Is there anything about Hebrew as a language that you feel like informs your work? Like, like some languages they don't have a future tense or they're more lyrical. You know what I mean? Like, is there something
Mm-hmm.
about that specific language that maybe someone could pick out in your English writing?
You know, I I don't think so. Um, but I'm sure it in some way it's had an effect, but not in a way that like I can parse.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, I need to thank Hebrew for being a writer because that's the language I started writing creatively in.
Right.
Because when I was about 16, my dad got sick with cancer. And that was also when I started, I learned about this poetry reading that, and it was like a website that also had a reading. So it was like an early kind of blog, that was sort of like you could post your own writing on. It was sort of like a deviant art, but for writing.
Sure.
And it was an Israeli website, although people sometimes wrote in other languages there. But it was started, if I'm understanding correctly, and if I'm remembering correctly, it was started by Edgar Keret, who's an Israeli flash fiction writer.
Okay.
One of like, it's kind of funny because there isn't really a flash fiction culture in a lot of places, but like he's super known as this short story writer. And so from that website, which was called like Bama Chadasha, New Stage, there was also a poetry reading that went with it. And I went to it with my first girlfriend, and it was very revelatory, because it was the first place that I'd ever seen like performance art.
Yeah.
Also, like this big, tall, bearded, long-haired dude just walked up to the microphone when it was like his turn and took this deep breath and then just yelled, "Bitch, son of a bitch," and then got off. It's like, whoa, okay, interesting. Apparently that's art. Cool. And so I started writing like bad poetry, as many teenagers do. And then I started writing short stories in Hebrew first. So from there I started transitioning to English as a writing language, but because I knew I wanted to move here eventually. So,
Sure.
But I really don't know how to like track the relationship.
Yeah. That makes sense. Is your early writing out there somewhere in the ether, or?
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't know if the New Stage website still exists. I should check. But my first blog in English, slightlyignorant.wordpress.com, is full of extremely published, very early writing. If anybody, I wrote in it for a while every day, for a while less than every day. It's probably very embarrassing. I haven't gone back in a long time, but it's years. I mean, I wrote there for years. It was sort of my way of practicing just being okay with being read, and like sort of trying to fail in public and learn in public in some way, because then, and also, early days of blogging, there was a lot of community.
Right.
So I was reading other people, they were reading me, like it felt like I was part of a bunch of other writers who were sort of like scrambling to figure out what our writing was going to be like.
Remember when the internet was like a good thing? Remember that?
Yeah, I actually do remember with that.
So much potential, and just bringing worlds together and people together and community. And
yeah, I know. It's sort of depressing. It also is so much more open, right? Like now it's we go to apps. We go to like websites that are also apps on our phones. It's like this streamlined thing now.
Yeah, right. It's like, I don't know if I've ever used the word out loud, but siloed, right? It's like a siloed type of thing. Yeah.
It's totally siloed.
Yeah. I think you were saying, isn't that part of one or both of your, or more of your social media handles, but the slightly ignorant part?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. It's so that's very old. It's from my podcasting days.
All right.
Podcasting. It's from my blogging days. Excuse me.
Blogging days. So who were some of those writers who really, turned you on to fiction, to novels growing up, that just made you that double feeling of like, wow, this is unbelievable, I could never do that, and also I want to do this?
Yeah, so I mean, the first book that I read on my own was Harry Potter, which I have very complicated feelings about now. But it meant a whole lot to me growing up, so I can't like erase that feeling of what it meant to me at the time. But then I really just got into fantasy, so like I read everything Tamara Pierce has ever written. I'm still waiting for her to publish that new Mare book. It's funny, she hasn't gotten the hate that George R. R. Martin has gotten, which I'm grateful for because she
Yeah.
doesn't deserve it.
Does he, or you're saying no one
No,
deserves
no,
it?
no, nobody deserves
Okay,
it. I'm
okay,
just
okay.
saying, he's fine, like
Sure.
he's making plenty of money from the
Yeah,
shows,
yeah,
I'm
yeah. He's
sure. Um, and I got into way too young. I got into this fantasy series that is also very racy, called Kushiel's. I think the title of the whole thing is like Kushiel's Legacy, but the first one is Kushiel's Dart. Um, and I read a lot of high fantasy novels as I was in my teens,
mm-hmm.
and a lot of YA, Sarah Dessen. I read a bunch
Oh
of
yeah.
British YA because in
Hmm.
Israel the bookstores didn't have, if they had an American section, I mean, if they had an English section, it was classics.
Okay.
It was like, one or two shelves of classics, obviously, just because, those are everywhere. And then if they had any YA, it was British because there was more of a relationship at the time with
What is British YA like?
uh,
Kinky?
a lot, yes, but also a lot more risque than the
Oh,
American.
okay.
Like,
Huh.
like 13-year-olds dating 18-year-olds and that being somehow fine.
I wouldn't think that would be that way. Wow, that's interesting. Huh.
Yeah, at least at the time. I mean, I'm sure it's changed, but it was a lot racier. There was a lot
Huh.
of snogging and
Huh.
second base for like 13 and 14-year-olds, which in American YA certainly was not a thing.
No. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I,
So those at the beginning, and that was sort of what inspired me to write my very first novel, which
hmm.
was a 200,000 word high fantasy novel,
Whoa.
which was not good. But probably it's not. I looked at the first page a while ago, and it's not as bad as I expected it to be.
Yeah.
But then when I was in college, I started reading the classics, because which I never really read because
Mm.
the things I learned in school were not the American classics, except for Catcher in the Rye, which
Oh,
we
okay.
had to read in Hebrew.
Huh.
Um, and when I was in college, I had to take a year off because I was very sick with anorexia. And during that year, I was super miserable. But I was also, the way that I sort of dealt with that was by reading a ton. And
Mm.
I read 144 books that year.
I'm sorry?
144 books that
What?
year. I know, I've never read that much since. And a bunch of them were classics that
Huh.
I had not read. So I was trying to sort of like complete
Catch
my
up.
education or
Uh-huh.
something. Uh, and it was the first time I'd read like Virginia Woolf and, like
Okay.
all of these other people. And it was amazing. And I just got very excited about realist fiction as well
Yeah.
as about fantasy. So it was my first time really like getting super into, I mean, both classics and like that was, I think, the first time that I read like The Handmaid's Tale and like all of
Mm.
these sort of books that were a lot more overtly political.
Right.
And yeah, so that was sort of where I transitioned to realist fiction.
Yeah. 144 books is no is no joke.
I
In
think a
in a
lot of them
lifetime, you know?
were, yeah, but I think a lot of them were me rereading Tamara Pierce books
Oh,
also
okay.
as like a comfort in between the serious books. So
The comfort.
yeah.
I wonder if there was a faithful translation of phony into Hebrew, from Catch in the Rye.
Oh, gosh, I don't remember what the translation was. I'm gonna look that up later
You
because I'm
know?
wondering what it was.
That's that commonly used word in the book for sure.
Oh
Everyone
yeah,
was a phony. Everyone was a phony, Holden.
everybody
Okay.
was.
All right.
Hmm.
So when you say classics, like, are you talking American classics?
American and British classic,
Yeah,
Anglo classics.
sure,
Yeah, yeah, mostly
sure.
Anglo classics.
Okay. Um, did did you feel like those were representative of your life experience? I mean, I guess that's hard to say when there's so many different ones. Was it
Right.
kind of like this is what I'm supposed to read, or was it like that you talk about realist fiction? Like,
Yeah.
is that where you really began to like see yourself?
No, I don't think so. I think it was just when I began to sort of see how big realist fiction could be, like how, because fantasy is so imaginative, right?
Sure.
And I think that I hadn't quite understood or seen yet the ways that like realist fiction could also be super expansive and also like explore a ton of different kinds of life experiences
Mm-hmm.
and also be really magical. And also I started seeing like other forms, like the way Virginia Woolf writes is like so different than the
Mm-hmm.
way any kind of commercial fiction, as we might call it, was written, which is largely what I had read before, and so just getting to see these kind of different forms and seeing the way that like a Victorian writer wrote and how Jane Austen wrote is so different from realist fiction today,
Sure,
right?
sure.
So it showed me how many options there were, I think.
There was a Jane Austen shout out, wasn't there, in your book?
Oh, probably,
I think
yes,
so.
somewhere.
I think so. I think it. Yeah. I think, um, I think it took me about I don't know, a couple of days for me to figure out that Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, the play, was not
Yeah.
written by Virginia Woolf.
Yeah, at some point I definitely didn't know that either. And I also learned that. I've never seen that or read it, which I feel like I should.
I remember being so taken by it. It was so I mean, we read it in high school and it was maybe a little above our heads, like, subject matter wise and whatever, but it was like it was about this couple and it was like a really just the tension is the way that the tension is built is so good. They're like playing like sexual games kind of with each other, with their
Ah.
partners, and just kind of like there's so much about jealousy and yeah,
Mm.
that'd be a good one to reread for sure.
Yeah, or read for the first time in my
Or read for the
case.
first time. There you
Yeah.
go. As you got into college and beyond, like, I mean, were you like a major in creative writing? Did you know when did you kind of know like I'm good at this? People give me this feedback. I can do this for a living.
Well, I mean, I don't think I knew I was going to be able to do it for a living, but my first creative writing teacher in college, Brian Morton, who I'm still friends with. I mean, I
Awesome.
transitioned from being his student to being his friend after
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right,
graduating,
right, right.
Um, he's the one who really like made me believe that I had something, that I
Hmm.
could do this. Because I was writing this novel in his class. And the way Sarah Lawrence works is there's a lot of contact with the teachers. Like you have a conference with them, so like a meeting with them basically every 2 weeks.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of one-on-one time because it's a very small school.
Nice.
Um, and he's the one who really made me feel like I'm good at this, I can do this. And then when I went to Oxford. There's a study abroad program at Sarah
Right.
Lawrence, and so I went to Oxford for that study abroad program, which was part of why I chose the school, because I was like, ooh,
Hmm.
Oxford, that would be cool.
Hmm.
um, and while I was there, I took a year-long tutorial with a poet, Kieran Wynn, and he this is actually coming out in a piece in a list with the Atlantic on Sunday.
Oh, nice.
um, uh, I tell this little story there, which is that I told him that I had never read Ulysses
Mm.
and that I was never going to,
That-
because it was too big and too scary and I didn't care. And he was like, okay, start reading Ulysses and come back next week with something written that's inspired by that, which, like, what a tall order, uh, and that year I also read a ton because we had to write, like, for my literature tutorial, we had to write, or I had to write a paper about a novel every single week,
Mm.
like, a 7 to 12 page paper,
Yeesh.
and I had to read the novel and then read criticism of the novel and figure out, like, at Sarah Lawrence they didn't want you to use sources at first. They wanted you to just figure out what do you think.
Uh-huh.
And in Oxford they didn't care what you think. They wanted to know how you used other people's thoughts
Sure.
to make
Precedent.
some kind of point. Yeah.
Huh.
And so I think that's probably part of what got me interested in criticism.
Yeah.
And I sorry. And so yes, so that year was when I started writing sort of experimentally for the first
Mm.
time because of Ulysses. And it was also the year that I first like had any sort of success with my writing, by which I mean I won a contest.
Mm.
I worked for the Oxford Student for that entire year, which is the like one of the two big student newspapers.
Mm.
Um, And so I was also like in a semi newsroom.
Hmm.
And I edited the arts and literature section. And I started a little fiction corner there.
Oh, cool.
I had my first two reviews accepted, not paid or anything. And so
Hmm.
that was, I think, really the beginning of me being like, oh, there are ways that I can do this that aren't just writing fiction. Like I can do all
Mm-hmm.
of this other stuff as well.
Mm.
Um, but I didn't really think that that it was going to happen for me. And so I was in my last year in college, I like got an internship at a bookish startup. And my goal was like to work in publishing, because if I work in publishing, then I'll learn everything I need to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And if I don't get published ever, well, at least I'll work with books all the time.
There you go. Good
So that was
consolation
sort of my
prize.
plan.
Ah. Well, yeah. So that's interesting. That you had those really polar opposites with criticism, right? At
Hmm.
Oxford and then at Sarah Lawrence. I wonder, like, to this day, like, is it hard? I think of like a coach in like a sport, and
Hmm.
you could watch video a million times, like trying to look at tendencies and run this play and this and that. And so you're watching a game, maybe it's hard to like just watch it for fun.
Hmm.
Do you find that with reading, where like you have trouble like reading for pleasure?
I feel so incredibly lucky because in fact, no.
Huh.
I always have a book going, or almost always have a book going that's just for fun.
Hmm.
I read before bed always, like I can't
Hmm.
go to sleep without reading
Hmm.
first. And I feel really lucky that I have not come to hate reading. Quite the opposite. I feel like,
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes, I'll read a book for a review and it's difficult, or I don't love it,
Hmm.
or I don't figure out if I can't figure out if I like it or not. And then it feels more like work.
Hmm.
And I mean, it feels like work because I'm thinking about it like work,
Hmm.
but that A doesn't mean that I'm not enjoying it.
Sure.
And B, I still, I still read for pleasure, just for sheer pleasure. And it's like I'll finish my work for the day and then I'll go read
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
before bed. So I really do feel very, very lucky that it is still my favorite thing in the world to do.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. The idea of like, reading with a critical eye, and you said, sometimes you don't love it. Are you like, how are you trained, just like in the industry or just yourself personally? Like, what if it's a book that you're just like, book is terrible. Like this book is just crap. Like, does that mean no review, or that means you kind of dance around it, or?
Well, so it really depends because I my approach to criticism is that I'm not interested in whether I like the book or not. Like
Hmm.
that to me, like I mean that might come into the review,
Yeah.
and it does often, especially if I really love the book. But what I'm really trying to figure out is whether the book is succeeding on the terms that it has set for itself. Like,
Hmm.
is it doing what it has set out to do? Um, and there have been books that I have known were not for me. Like I'm not the ideal reader for them because it's not my style, or I don't love this plot device. But I have known that it's a good book because it's succeeding on its own terms. It's just not a book
Sure.
for me.
Yeah.
So in that way, I still have that's not difficult for me to write about because then I'm thinking about it just very analytically, right?
Hmm.
The only books that I've really not liked and reviewed poorly are books that don't feel like they're succeeding on their terms. Or if they're like just horrendously problematic in a way that like
Right.
ruins anything that's working about the book. So like
Yeah.
there was a mystery that I was assigned to read, and I knew I could see the twist coming from a mile away. It was both insulting to trans people and insulting to uh, Afghan people, and it was bad in all sorts of ways, and it was trying to sort of make a point about difference and how, but it was doing this like there's always a few bad apples thing as opposed to like
Hmm.
looking at anything more deeply, and that was maybe one of the only hatchet reviews that I've ever written, really. Um, because I don't find it interesting. I don't find
Sure.
I don't find I find it more of a challenge to figure out like what the book is doing well.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you're making the delineation between like problematic, racist, homophobic versus just like, oh, it didn't wasn't my thing, or
Right.
but it's yeah. I used to use and it's a pretty dated reference, maybe even then, but I used to use the analogy of like the Dave Matthews Band.
Mm,
Not my thing.
right.
Not a fan, but hey, good. Like they're good. You know, they do a
Yeah.
violin thing and they're talented. Just not my thing.
Right. Totally. Totally. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
I don't think any of our students would get that reference, but anyways.
I
So
don't know. It
maybe
depends, So, well, I mean, there's always some of those students who are into,
there is
you
the
know,
old souls,
yeah.
and or maybe dad or mom showed it to him, or older cool uncle or something like that.
Hmm.
Yeah, I wonder what which writers or writing is really impressing you or inspiring you these days. I'm sure again that list is such a long one.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where it's like, oh, I don't know. Well, recently though, uh, let's see. I need to see if
Get
the
that
book
bookshelf.
is still there. Um, Yeah, these are books that are coming out later. Well, one of the books that I read recently that I just am obsessed with is Before All the World by
Hmm.
Muriel Rossmann Zecher.
Okay.
Yes, that's the order. And it's experimental. It uses it's sort of it's very meta in that it's like the form of it is it's a translation, and fictional translation of a fictional Yiddish narrative,
Whoa.
and the way that the
Meta.
translation works is that it's trying to like copy Yiddish, or it's trying to evoke and keep Yiddish cadence. And so there's all of these combination words because Yiddish has a lot of like combination words, sort of like in German.
Right.
Um, and there's just something, it's so delicious and it's so beautiful
Mm.
and it's so painful, but the painful is sort of being reflected in the writing. It's not like gratuitous, it's not trauma porn, it's
Hmm.
just it's this sort of soul pain.
Wow.
And it's just gorgeous, but it's also like hopeful as well in
Mm.
these particular ways where it's sort of like finding connection amid darkness. So not like a happy ending or anything, but it's like
Mm.
just finding those connections that keep us all alive and that keep us all like
Wow.
going. Um, yeah, so I am still thinking about that book, and wanting to sort of do something like that.
Yeah. A possible German or Yiddish word might be smorgasbord.
I have no idea actually where that
Sounds like
originates,
a
but
compound, but it sounds like that book is that, right? You're talking about it's hopeful, but it's
yes.
also painful. And I hope someone will say about my writing that it's delicious,
Yes. Oh,
right?
so yes, yes,
Right?
yes. Because there's something about language,
Hmm.
that when it's working in a particular way, it's like you can feel it. You can feel
Yes.
it in your body.
Yeah. I have a great depth to I'm a writer, but I heard your interview with I'm a writer, but
Yeah,
for information on you and just in general, it's a great podcast. Check
it
it
is.
out if you're listening. But you were talking about like some of the books that were out on submission, right? And you liked certain things about them, but they didn't
Hmm.
come together for the agent or whatever.
Right.
Like I guess what you were just saying remind me of like, do you what's the expression, like you must kill all your darlings? Like is that tough for you? Like hey, this is like on a sentence structure, on a sentence basis, like this is awesome and it stands alone, but it doesn't fit with the rest. Like is that like extra tough for you?
I mean, I don't know because I don't super believe in that maxim of
Okay.
kill your darlings. I mean, I think
Yeah.
I think Reese Kwan, R.O. Kwan, she talks about something where she's like, no, keep your darlings. Like your darlings are what you're supposed to keep. Like what is with this weird writing advice? And I think that there's always going to be stuff that doesn't fit, right? Like there are going to be things that feel like I really love this, but it doesn't fit with the greater whole.
Hmm.
But then you don't have to kill it. You just put it away and
There you
maybe you
go.
use it later, you
Yeah, yeah,
know?
yeah. Okay.
Um,
Makes sense.
and also for me, editing is the best part of writing, honestly. Like I love
Oh,
having written. So, and then being able to play with what I've got there.
yeah.
Um, so I think it's not super difficult. It's more just fun, that part
Hmm.
of it.
All My Mother's Lovers came out during COVID. the early
Yes,
days, right?
very early days of COVID.
Man, what I know you said it was fairly quick as books go, very quick as books go, the publishing, the
Yeah.
writing of it, the editing. What were some of the seeds for the book, I wonder?
Well, it was really like a sentence, it was like this sentence that was rolling around my head one night. And usually, you forget the sentences that are rolling around your head
For
at night,
real.
especially if you're the
God
kind of
damn.
person like me who does not get up and write them down because I'm lazy and I'm in bed and I just don't fucking feel like it. Um, but this one didn't. I woke up and was still thinking about it, and that was very close to what the first sentence of the book still is. And I sort of started doing a lot and sort of just like journaling and figuring out like who are these people that because there's four characters
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
in that first sentence, so who are they?
Well, first lines are gonna go. I mean, go down in history with like Marquez and
Oh, I
yeah,
would love that, my
yeah,
god.
pun not intended.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to read it
Oh
or if you want to
gosh.
give us a summary of it
uh
but it's definitely a memorable line.
I think it's Maggie is in the midst of a second lazy orgasm when her brother calls to tell her their mother has died.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Oh, yay, look at
I mean,
me.
that's Marquez-ish. I mean, that's gonna pull the reader in right away, right?
Or
Man.
push them away. I mean, here's the
Or
thing, right? It's
I,
a first line that certainly my editor actually asked me, like, do you want to maybe add a prologue, like a one-page prologue, just
so
so
it's
it's
kind of the
not the
beginning.
beginning?
Yeah, yeah.
And I was like, no, because the thing is, if if it's not right for someone, they'll know immediately. If that is
Yeah.
disturbing enough for them that they want to turn away, okay. Otherwise, what? They'll read the prologue, they'll like it, and then the next page they'll be like, "Hey, no," and throw it
Right.
across the room.
Right.
I'd rather them know what they're getting into from the beginning.
Yeah. So I'm sure you kind of pat yourself on the back for that first line. That's pretty
I mean, I still like it, yeah.
right. And so